But in either case, hey, I want to talk about an update I made, several updates in fact, to the one divine budget chieftain build that I had released earlier. As you can see, we are no longer a primalist. We have in fact switched over to Warlock. This is going to be a big part of the shift. One of the complaints that people had is that they wanted more single target damage, especially if they ended up in situations where they weren't able to drag monsters into rares, especially like life regen rares or something, or if they weren't able to drag a monster into a map boss. Maybe they run cemeteries, maybe they run Alira and none of the monsters got to Alira, although she does spawn zombies. Effectively, I wanted a solution to that, and our solution is Penance Mark. It's a Warlock ability from Choir of the Damned. You can only have one of the 3 Warlock power passives. Penance Mark curses a single enemy, causing them to spawn multiple phantasms when hit. It has a 1-second cooldown, but it'll spawn 3 phantasms. Why this is nice is because we are Chieftain. Chieftain has Hinekora, Death's Fury. Enemies you kill or totems that kill an enemy have a 5% chance to explode, dealing 500% of their maximum life as fire damage. The phantasms, while they don't have the life of a rare monster, they have more life than a white monster, or maybe even a magic monster. It's quite significant. It's a very good way to generate damage in single target. Important for this is that it's constant. Unlike something like Vol Breach, you always have Penance Mark. You always have access to it. So if you are doing the Wildwood and you come across a King of the Mists and you have to go into the isolated fight, you don't have an issue with single target. You have your whole build at the ready. So that is the first major change that I'm making, is that we're playing Warlock. You can also see I have a second notable here, Sanguimancy. What Sanguimancy does is it effectively is blood magic, but with a life reservation bonus instead of more life. We're using the life reservation bonus to be able to fit more auras on purely life. You'll have less auras than an alternate mana build, but for our purposes, it's more than sufficient. What we're currently using is I run a Petrified Blood, a Purity of Elements on Blessing, a Vitality, and a Purity of Fire. The Purity of Fire gives us max res and additional res. It's very good with Chieftain. Petrified Blood synergizes well with the bloodnotch combo as well as Defiance of Destiny. And Purity of Elements is what I'm using to solve ailments, as well as give us a little more resistance. Say Blessing because, if you see here, because we're a blood magic build, because all of our auras are not attached to mana, we need to use Eternal Blessing, which effectively is a blessing that's always active. It just disables your mana reserve skills, of which we have none. On that note, as I said, Sanguimancy is very similar to blood magic in that it causes you to reserve life, to spend life, removes all your mana. This allows us to path beside blood magic and click a 10% more maximum life modifier for 1 point. It's very efficient, getting our effective HP up. You can see this is a budget character. You're wearing a Cloak of Flames. This doesn't have life. This has crafted life. This has a good life roll. This has a good life roll. No life roll. No life roll. Crafted life. We're still 4.8k life. It's quite significant, especially with all of our layered defenses. As you can see down here, we're taking the Champion of the Cause wheel. We don't have anything up here with sovereignty like traditional builds because, once again, we're a life-based build. We don't have mana reservation. We don't have mana to reserve. All of our things are life-based. So we're going to take the reservation mastery down here for 20% life reservation, in conjunction with Champion of the Cause, giving us another 8% and another 8% from the small. We're doing this so we can fit our auras in. You can see here, our reservation is 2,000, even though our life is 2,700. What I'm using here is, if I turn on my Blood Rage, you can see my life will degen a little. In theory, a little. There we go. You'll see my life degens a little, but it still doesn't quite reach the point. We're utilizing the mastery here of you count as low life while at 55% life or below. An important caveat about this is that if we look at Petrified Blood here, it prevents life recovery from anything that isn't a flask above low life. This means that we can recover that extra 5% life. However, that 5% life isn't covered in the when taking hits, damage from hits, it prevents the damage. So you're still getting a little bit of extra HP on top, but just be aware that it's not quite the Petrified Blood life. Beyond that, one of the main reasons that I want to be Sanguimancy, that I want to be a life build, I want to be a blood magic build, is that in a traditional build, you have to use a life tap support gem in the earlier versions if you're playing like a Primalist version, especially when you scale up to a 5-link in your Desecrate and your Guard skill, a 6-link on your main Detonate Dead, you'll be draining anywhere from 1200 to like 1800 life a second. You have enough bonus recoup, you generally can offset this, but if you ever end up in a situation where you're fighting like a Soul Eater enemy, or if you're fighting, you know, a Lyra is a really good example of this, or just like an isolated rare that has Soul Eater where they're hitting you for not a lot of damage, but they're hitting you quite rapidly, you will just degen down. And so being able to move away from life tap, being able to remove all those sockets is quite important. Speaking of sockets, I've made a change from the Searing Touch. Because we freed up so many sockets and there isn't really that much you need to fit into the build, I've moved to a Gray Spire. This is an old Delve item that gives you a lot of global damage as well as maximum resistances, which is build I wouldn't say desperately needs, but definitely could use. You can find these, they're very cheap. This is a perfect roll, it has 300% damage. I think it rolls from 250 to 300. The important part is that you find a 4 max res and then like, I don't know, 290 damage or more. They're extremely cheap. They're like 5C. I was buying perfect ones from anywhere from 5C, 10C, all the way up to a Divine. I bought like a whole stash of them. You can get 290s for cheap. I'm going to corrupt them later for some memes. You don't have to worry about that. As you can see here, this is a level 92 build. I'm level 96, but we floated some points to help people fit it all in without worrying about it too much. We still have the same fluid motion to solve dexterity. We still have a regular immutable. It's a mid-roll. They're very cheap. We still have a low-roll bloodnotch. We still have a low-roll Defiance of Destiny. These haven't changed. We picked up a little more damage with Elemental Overload and Acrimony. Acrimony is going to help our Penance Mark Hinekora explosions as well as our Detonate Dead. And Elemental Overload will help us start our initial chains when we're just clearing monsters with Detonate Dead. Speaking of Detonate Dead, we also have Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction. Because I've moved to Penance Mark being my solution to tanky and difficult single target monsters, I'm less inclined to use an ability such as regular Detonate Dead, which has a significantly higher ignite damage, to something that just has a more consistent always happening so that we can begin killing white monsters and we can clear corpses around spires. So I've moved to Chain Reaction in that case. We're still using just a very basic Chaos Res cluster to solve Chaos Res. I've changed flasks. You may have noticed I used to have 3 Quicksilvers. Now we have a Sulfur Flask and 2 Quicksilvers. I went with a very cheap 1 charge when you're hit, reduce curse effect Sulfur. It's important that I use Sulfur because it generates Consecrated Ground. One of the effects of Consecrated Ground is that it grants life regeneration as well as a reduced curse effect. So in conjunction with the suffix on this that has reduced the curse effect, anytime you're standing over the Sulfur Flask effect, you have 100% reduced effective curses. Anytime you're being attacked by a swarm of Abyss monsters, or even just like a regular mapping, 1 charge per hit is more than sufficient to keep it going. Huge, huge improvement. One of the issues that I had found with the build before was that Hexer mobs were very dangerous with Punishment Curse, causing you to take a ton of extra damage, and this was my solution. I still like having the 2 enkindled Quicksilvers to move through the forest, though. On that note, though, people had asked what would I do if, I guess we could talk about this too. I had added an Eater implicit to the gloves. You can just use a regular one. Pick up fire damage leached as life. You don't do a lot of fire damage, but you do enough through all the chain explosions, just like the flat damage from the chain explosions, that this will give you a little bit more recovery over time. Because you're a Petrified Blood build, you have Overleach. It's a really cheap addition. I would recommend it. That being said, a lot of people asked, what do I do next? I put together your build. I enjoyed it. Where do I go from here? And a lot of the times people would be like, you know, I've seen your other builds. It has a Mage Blood. I don't want to do that. What do I do? So I've picked up some improvements you can do going forward, and like what I would do if I were to invest another 10, 20, 50 Divines into the build, which you can pretty readily farm with this build. So the big thing that you start with is that you would go to a 6-link. This is obviously a 6-link, but we're only using a 4-link. But you would swap your Combustion, Cast One Stun, Cruelty, Detonate Dead into a 6-link. I'm just using a white socket one because it was easier to move around gems earlier. And get a 4 off instead. And so we swap this in, and I pick up Culling Strike and Hypothermia. Hypothermia you can either apply through a cold snap trigger, or what I've picked up is nearby enemies are chilled. This will give us a slight defensive application, but more importantly, it just enables hypothermia. The other things I do are we take our Maw of Conquest, which was a great source of anti-poison and recoup. We replace it with a chaos resistance, high life, regeneration, as well as physical shift. It says physical damage taken from hits is taken as lightning, and physical damage taken as hits is taken as fire damage. I will note, on the Eldritch Implicit, you can roll physical damage taken as hits as lightning, fire, cold, or chaos. I would not recommend chaos, because even if you're capped, it's only going to be 75 versus your 85 to 90. And I would not recommend cold because of a bug. It's not a bug. I would recommend it. There's a mechanic in the game where if a monster is going to freeze you, it cannot stun you. Monsters freeze you if they do cold damage to you. So if you roll a very high amount of critical chance on maps, then you would not want to force every monster to have cold damage against you. Recommendation to avoid physical damage taken is cold if possible. But we replace it here. We're still going to use a very similar setup. So before we're using Desecrate, Enfeeble, Void Sphere, Cast One Stun, we would still use Desecrate, Cast One Stun, Feeble, and Void Sphere. I was testing out Void Sphere of Rending. I don't really know which one I like better. I think I would prefer using a qualitied regular Void Sphere. Even though it has an 8-second cooldown, the AoE is just much, much, much higher. And what you're doing is you're trying to cause a Void Sphere to pull Abyss rares together, as well as pull phantasms. While they generally spawn close enough for Hinekora to explode, it's nice to force them to spawn close enough, especially if you're running less AoE maps. I would recommend getting a quality Void Sphere. I'd recommend getting a leveled Void Sphere. We replace it here. We get a bunch of physical shift. This helps with our physical mitigation. We're going to replace our Chaos Res Crafted Life Spread Gloves with some Dexterity Chaos Res Life Gloves. This is important because we want to try to move away from this fluid motion. Jewel sockets are very valuable. We're going to replace our regular old 18% gold worms with some +2 AoE or +2 aura gold worms. 20% quantity. They're under a divine. They're expensive, but worthwhile. The reason I stress having +2 AoE or +2 aura is because we're going to move into higher level and better auras, specifically Purity of Fire. Purity of Fire is a gem that when you hit level 23, instead of having 4 maximum res, you have 5 maximum res. This is important because 1, you get a maximum res, and 2, you need slightly less aura effect to be able to push this to 6 maximum res as opposed to 4 to 5. Just how it works, right? The tree also goes through a bunch of adjustments. We'll get to those in a moment. We get to drop our fluid motion. Opens up a jewel socket. We'll just put, I don't know, that which was taken there. I would recommend getting an explode that which was taken over a nearby chilled one as well, but if you keep them together, fantastic. There were a few up when I was searching earlier. They're expensive. An explode that which was taken is about 30 divines by nature, but you know, it increases your chance to explode by 20%. You really can't argue with that. It's a significant increase. And like I said, if you can find one with nearby chill, it'll enable hypothermia, which is a great support gem that both adds to your hit damage as well as your dot damage. But that being said, at the end of the day, the links to your Detonate Dead don't matter. Most of your damage is still going to be Hinekora and Penance Mark. Just keep that in mind. We're going to replace our flasks. We'll say goodbye to our... My game just crashed. Why you gotta be this way, game? You'll cut production, 1 second. I'm back. Can you send you a POB and tell me why I do no damage? I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Yeah, I'll gladly look at it after this. Let me finish this. Alright, we're back. Roll film. It's just, the video's going to have this. It's just how it's going to go. Anyway, so we're going to drop our Anti-Curse Sulfur Flask. We drop our Corrupted Blood Life Flask. We drop our 2 Quicksilvers, although I kind of like having these. And I'm going to bring in a Taste of Hate to increase our physical mitigation. I'm bringing an onslaught of rarity in for a little bit of speed as well as rarity while we're magic finding. We're going to bring in a quicksilver of movement, both of these with 3 charges when you're hit by an enemy to enable them going. And we're bringing in a Kiara's Determination, of which I will get to later. It's not that good, but it has an interesting use, so we'll bring that up. As we are also upgrading, we're going to get a much better Defiance of Destiny. You don't need a life roll as high as this, but I do recommend getting a missing unreserved life of 40 to 42%. So we'll swap this out. I still recommend Vampirism. It's very good to have an excess amount of recoup. Although, if you really want to skimp on it because of like you have a little bit of recoup from the helmet, it wouldn't be the worst thing. But I don't really know what you would put into it. Like, you don't really need damage in this build, so I wouldn't recommend it. So, if we are moving away from our budget tree to our more expensive tree, let me grab some regrets real quick. We're going to move away from endurance charges because we're picking up a lot more physical shift. We're going to move all the physical damage to elemental damage as best we can. Let me see. We're going to take those points. We're going to drop these reservation nodes because we're going to use Enlighten to offset that. And we're going to drop this Chaos Res cluster because we're using gear to offset that. The Chaos Res cluster is going to get replaced with a large cluster. You can kind of pick and choose whatever you want here. It doesn't matter. It's mostly important that you're using a large cluster that gives you something. In this case, I'm using Burning Bright for a little bit of AoE and damage, and Prismatic for a little bit, pardon me, of resistances to make sure that you're overcapped on your lighting and cold for altars, and some damage. We're going to click the 2 jewel sockets. We're not going to go all the way to widespread. You don't need to go that far. Although I suppose you could if you want the AoE. And we're going to drop off Acrimony. And we're going to drop off Elemental Overload. So as I said, Elemental Overload is fantastic for your Detonate Dead damage, but once again, the majority of your single target, the majority of your emergency damage is Penance Mark Exploding Hinekora. You don't have to worry about that. So now that we have more money, there are some fun things we can do. We're going to do the traditional pathing for Chieftain all the way over here. We're going to put in our little Elegant Hubris. The Elegant Hubris I've chosen here, there's several varieties of it. You can also Impossible Escape if you want to find places where you can place it elsewhere. But mine has Chaos Resistance. As I said, we dropped the Chaos Cluster. We're trying to make sure that we have our Chaos Resistance as close to cap as possible. I have 80% avoid chance to shock here. And up here, I have a very convenient 20% chance to avoid all ailments. So between this and this, I have a 100% chance to avoid shock. Now, what can we do with this? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with Storm Shroud. Now I get to take my avoid the shock and apply it to all ailments. So now we're ailment immune. We're immune to ignites. We're not a fulcrum build. We don't care about that. We're immune to chills, to freeze. We're immune to the delirium effects. Really nice. I specifically have gotten one with a reduced effect of curse. They're not that expensive. There are a lot of them up. You don't need a max lighting res roll. You don't really need a max effect of curse roll. But I would recommend that corruption. Those if you have a CB one, then go for it. But those are crazy expensive. In conjunction with the reduced curse effect here, we're going to use our Rational Doctrine. They're running about 10 divines right now. What Rational Doctrine is going to do, the part that's important, is it's going to put a consecrated ground around us at all times, and they linger for 4 seconds. Consecrated ground, once again, has reduced curse effect. It has 50% reduced curse effect. And I think it has 6% life regen per second. It's either 3 or 6%. I don't quite remember. And something to remember is that this 50% and this regen is going to get boosted by devotion here. You get another 25% increase effect. So you're close to like 90% curse reduction. It's more than sufficient. We're going to pick up a Watcher's Eye by simply dropping off the bloodnotch. We're still going to be a cast 1 stun build. We're still going to use an immutable, of which we have a much higher percent, as well as answering hinder. You can answer hinder, you can answer maim, you can get the rest of the curse. You can get corrupted blood if you have one. Whatever you want here. I would recommend trying to fish for some good implicits off the trade site. And by dropping our bloodnotch, which our high roll Defiance of Destiny is going to provide all the defense you need. You don't need a bloodnotch on top of this. We're going to put in a Watcher's Eye. The mod that I would really stress here is that you get physical damage taken from hits as fire while affected by purity of fire. This in conjunction with our helmet, in conjunction with our cloak, in conjunction with, our armor and energy shield mastery over here, we're looking at close to, I think it's 75% physical damage taken as fire now. Maybe it's more. And then we could also add Taste of Hate onto it. It's effectively making it so that we don't have to worry about physical mitigation. We don't have to worry about endurance charges. We don't have to worry about armor. We don't have to worry about things that remove endurance charges. We don't have to worry about things that remove physical damage reduction. Being able to move away from those defenses makes it so that there's a lot more altar choices you have. There's a lot more map modifiers you can run. There's a lot more rare monsters that you don't care about. A huge improvement for the build. In addition to that, the things I would recommend is unaffected by bleeding is fantastic while having malevolence. Unaffected by poison while having malevolence is fantastic. In this case, I have an anti-bleed one, and I'll show you what the rest of my setup is with that in mind. Something else to keep in mind is that because we've solved our ailments using Storm Shroud, we no longer need Purgative Elements. Instead of Purgative Elements, if I can ever remember where I put stuff, we've replaced our Blessing with Malevolence. One, for access to the anti-ailment Malevolent Watcher's Eyes, as I spoke about, and two, it's just more damage. Who doesn't want more damage? It's an easy solution. Talking more on our reservation, as I said earlier, we get to splurge a little more, right? This is, you farmed for a few hours, you maybe had, a couple Valdo boxes, just some regular divines, you get to upgrade your build. We're picking up Enlighten to be able to fit our auras in now. And as you can see here, if once again we turn on our Blood Rage, you can see it burn down a little. This is our 55% point. We don't need the 20% reservation here. We don't need the 8% reservation here. It saves us some points. What we can do instead, as I said, we have a level 23 Purity of Fire. We currently have 6% increase of our effect and 6%. So we're at 12%. You need 20% to get another max res. Conveniently enough, we can click this right here. Oop. And so with our new setup in mind, we now have 89 all res. We have 90 res because of the energy shield node. It's just kind of how it looks. We're way over chaos cap. So we no longer have to use this amethyst ring. You're a little under. I think anything over 50 is more than fine. People have reported having as low as 20 chaos res and on Defiance build and still being fine in the Wildwood. I would still feel safer having over 50. We get to upgrade our Venters. The stats I would most focus on when upgrading your Venter gambles are 10% quantity first and foremost, followed by a high amount of life. You want over 50 life, and then following that, you want positive rarity. Somewhere around 20 is good, more is better, and then positive resistances. The important part about the resistances, you can see here I even have like a little bit of negative fire. The important part of the resistances is that you want your cold and lightning resistance to be set up in such a way that you can lose 120 resistance. That is 2 high rolled blue altars that reduce your resistance and still have your resistance cap. That is the goal of your build. Any fire resistance you get on top of that is just going to give you a lot of regeneration from your fire mastery. At this point, I still don't like Biscos, but your damage is quite significant where it's going to matter less that monsters don't attack you. But I would probably look for either, if you want to spend a lot of money, you can get a Quant Brandis Blazon, or if you want to spend a few divines, I would get a Malevolence Effect Brandon Blazon. I think that's all of the tree changes and all of the gear changes. So now I'll talk about the weapon swap. I showed some technology off. Ooh, that needs to get fixed. This needs to get dropped, and this needs to get dropped. Yeah, you would just use level 1 versions of these. Yeah, that's fine. Their levels don't matter. But I showed off some tech, if you will, where people would come to me with their Chieftain builds and be like, hey, I want to do Abyssal Spires, but I keep blowing them up. What can I do? And what I do is I will apply with the main hand. I will apply a small ignite. It can just be the Detonate Dead ignite. It doesn't have to be a Hinekora ignite. You definitely don't want it to be a rare ignite or else you'll kill a Spire. You apply a small ignite to the monster, and then when swapping over, you equip a cold iron point. The cold iron point won't prevent current ignites from doing damage, but it will prevent future ignites from generating damage, as well as the explosions. The way we keep that initial ignite going is through defiled forces, which makes it so that every time we cast a curse, it will refresh the duration of ailments, and we have the cast one stun and feeble up here, constantly rolling, constantly refreshing that low ignite. You can use a Dawnbreaker here if it makes you feel safer. You can use a Centauri's here. There will be monsters that die. It doesn't really matter. The important part is that you have a cold iron point here. But I think that's it. You can do this on the budget version. You can do this on the expensive version. Cold iron points are like 5C. 15% or more physical damage taken. Dawnbreakers are 2C. I'd really recommend it. But yeah, that's the updates I have. When you get 2 more points in the Warlock for either of them, you can do a couple things. You can either click 2 more Wildwood points, which is what I would recommend so that you get more wisps, you get more loots. Alternatively, you can click things like, you can move this point away and you can move it over, you can move this point away, sorry. If you feel better having like the notables, you can click Blood Hunt and Foul Pact. So this is what your tree would look like. You would get 2 more points. Clicking Blood Hunt, I would recommend consuming an Abyss monster or a Beyond monster. I assume they all have the same category within themselves. Those are going to be the most dangerous types of monsters in a map, but it's pretty unnecessary. And if you take Foul Pact, it just makes it so that you gain even more flash charges, and then you can gain ball souls from the phantasms. It's a nice little thing. They already give you flash charges, but you can get some more. But my recommendation is just click more Wild Wisp, get more juice. But yeah, I think that's it. If you want to get a Corrupted Cloak of Flames, my recommendation is max res. It's expensive. I wouldn't go with reduced crit. Actually, you can go with reduced crit. So like, we use the anti-stun mastery here, where it's like, hits against you can't be critical strikes if you've been stunned recently. But sometimes you re-enter a map and you don't have crit mitigation. So if you want to get a crit one here, it's probably worth it. You don't need 90 max res. You don't even need 89. I think 85 is more than sufficient, honestly speaking, even in juice T16s. There's an alternative to hypothermia if you can't get chill. No, I'm sure there is. If you can't, my recommendation is going to be you drop the Void Sphere and you put a Cold Snap here. And that'll help you with Frenzy generation, even though you'll already have Blood Rage. But then you can like drop the Blood Rage or something. But if not, then I would probably recommend item rarity support, honestly speaking. It should probably be an item rarity support right now anyway. Because like I said, the majority of your damage is coming from Hinekora's Penance. But yeah, that's my updated build. Oh yeah, the Kiaras. So this is what I was talking about with the weapon swap and why I was going to talk about it later. When you weapon swap like this and you have like, especially in like the very high purple maps, and you have 80 plus rare monsters attack you and all their little minions attacking you and all that stuff, sometimes you get locked. You get like straight up animation locked and you can't do anything. If you don't have a Droughtbringer mob spawn, which unfortunately happens a lot of the time, but if you don't have a Droughtbringer mob spawn, you can click this flask. I don't have a trigger on it. It's, you manually use it. You can click this flask to disable the stuns for a second. So you can Frostblink away and get out of there. But most of the times they spawn a Droughtbringer mob and it drains the charges and you can't use it. So, well, I think it was a fun idea. It didn't really pan out, I'll be honest with you. Just use some other flask. I don't know what. Maybe a gold flask. But yeah, that's the build. That's the update. You don't need a Mage Blood. You don't need a Headhunter. They're better. Go get them, but you know, this is the 50 Divine version. This is the 1 Divine version. They both tear up tier 16s. They're phenomenal. That's it. That's the build. Any questions? I don't know. Drop comments. Find me at Twitch. Send me letters by pigeon. You'll figure it out. Yeah. Hope you enjoy the builds. Take care. Oh, Pantheons. Real quick. I always forget to talk about Pantheons. Don't take Brian King. It bricks your build. People do this. I'm sorry I didn't mention it last time. If you have Brian King, you're a cast 1 stun build, you can't get stunned, your build doesn't work. Surprise. I would take Lunaris, personally. I would capture Claiborne. Reduce elemental damage. You've been hit recently, you're always hit. It's reduced damage, it's great. It's unnecessary, but I would probably go get it if I were you. I personally use Soul of Shikari because I have bleeds answered, so I use this for poison. If you have a poison Watcher's Eye, I would take Ralakesh, so you answer bleeds because you have poison answered. If you have neither, I would take Shikari, and I would have a flask with bleed. I would replace this with a bleed flask. Something to keep in mind is that if you're a Cloak of Flames build, this is 40% of the physical damage of all physical damage, including bleeds, gets converted to fire, and then it's reduced by, you know, roughly 90%. So you're not going to like bleed out, but you should still probably have an answer to bleeds. Yeah, okay, that's it.